Joining us now, it is our Chargers writers here at The Athletic. It's Daniel Popper. Daniel, appreciate the time, man. I know you had a long night.
Yeah, thanks for having me. We're rolling here, though. Got about 3 cups of coffee in my system, so I'm ready to fire off some takes.
Heck of a Monday night game. I mean, everything you could have wanted. Obviously, one that looked a lot better in the week prior than it would have looked at the beginning of the season, just because we had no idea what the Chargers were going to be, and now it's shaping up, or it did shape up as a game between likely playoff teams in the AFC. We have the whole John Harbaugh angle, which you were spared because you were at the game, so I'm a little jealous of you there. The fact that you didn't have to hear about the family dynamics of the Harbaugh brothers for the entire 60 years of their existence. That was if I had to do that to get the quality of game we got, that's fine. It's a price I was willing to pay. But at the end of the day, probably one of the better Monday night games from an entertainment perspective that I can remember, and also just the quality of play. Like sometimes you get a 30-27 game and it involves the Bengals defense and you're just like, this isn't necessarily good football, even if it's fun. Last night felt like a really compelling matchups between two very good football teams. And that's probably an interesting place for you to be as somebody who has been following the Chargers for the last 3 or 4 years. The fact that we're dealing with that sort of team as we round toward Thanksgiving here.
Yeah, I think that's been the biggest thing about the Jim Harbaugh effect is that you're just going to get a well-coached team. Like there's not going to be instances where the Chargers go into a game. Like I think about the Lions game last year where that defense just got absolutely torched. And it was just very obvious that they were overmatched as a coaching staff. Like that hasn't really happened this season. And so like there's a floor going into every game of what you're going to get in terms of effort, in terms of the cohesion on both sides of the ball. Now the execution, sometimes not there. The level of talent obviously was the difference in this game, but I think there's a floor as far as how they're going to play. And that's why you pay Jim Harbaugh $16 million a year is to get that quality from the coaching staff.
I want to talk about that takeaway, the lack of the gap in talent and why that was very evident by the end of the game last night, because I think that's kind of where I sat with it as well. But let's talk about kind of where this game swings before we dig into the Chargers specifics of this. The margins in this game are tiny, like tiny. We've got 3 4th and 1s, including one in the first half where I loved it. When they came back out and he was like, I'm going to go for this here on 4th and inches from my own 16-yard line with 2 minutes left in the half. I loved it for this reason. You felt the Chargers bleeding the game away in that first half. They were controlling the ball. They were controlling the clock. The game was being played on their terms. The Ravens had a couple very quick drives early on. It's a game of possessions. You only have so many possessions, especially when you're playing against a team like the Chargers that's trying to shorten the game however they can. So stealing back that possession and then going down and scoring that touchdown, it swings the game. The Chargers end up getting the field goal, so it's a little bit of a smaller gap at halftime than it would have been. But you're talking about 17-13 in your favor compared to being down by 10 points going into the half if the Chargers can somehow score again. So I want to spend a lot of time just as a general football community talking about that, because if it had gone wrong, it would have led every morning show in existence today in a way it's probably not right now because it actually worked out for the Ravens.
The number of times I had this conversation during this Brandon Staley era where like it felt like every time a 4th down went wrong, I was having the conversation, and yet never in a million years did we ever have a conversation about 4th downs that went right. Like the first drive in their win over the Bengals in 2022, never talked about it, right? So, it was a gutsy call. I mean, you're on your own 16. I think there's the decision to go for it, which like 4th and 1, if you're an analytically driven team, you're going to go for it pretty much every single time. The play call was what was fascinating to me. I mean, you have Derrick Henry and you line up Mark Andrews under center and run a sneak with the tight end. It was gutsy in the decision to go for it. It was also gutsy in what they ended up doing, especially on that touchdown drive before. The Chargers very obviously couldn't stop Derrick Henry. Now they had stopped him on the 3rd and 1 on the previous play, but I'm surprised they didn't just hand it off to 22 and be like, all right, go get a yard.
I need this stats on this before I just start crowing about it with a lot of confidence. I should probably go look them up. I feel like sneaks are the way to go. If you feel comfortable sneaking the football for whatever reason, some teams don't want to do it. Their quarterback doesn't take a lot of snaps under center, so you're worried about the exchange. You're worried about hurting your quarterback if you're the Chiefs. Patrick Mahomes does not do quarterback sneaks for this reason. But if you're a team that feels confident in the quarterback center exchange, or the tight end center exchange in this case, and you are okay with whoever ends up being the sneaker on your team, if you have less than a yard to go, that is what you should do every single time. It's one of my like old man pet peeve things that drives me absolutely crazy. So the fact that they were not willing to go back 3 yards into the backfield to hand it off in that moment, I'm okay with that, because I think that is typically the quickest route to convert those when it's on the table for you.
Yeah, absolutely. If you have the personnel and you have either the quarterback or in this case the tight end that's willing to do it and capable of doing it. But obviously the Chargers had a famous quarterback in Philip Rivers who did not sneak ever and was obviously like very
Which is so
opposed to
funny
that. So,
because Philip Rivers is 6'5", 230, and he probably would have been like one of the better quarterback sneakers in the league if he was just falling down in like 2 yards every time they needed it. The quarterback play in this game, period, I think on both sides of the ball. But there was a stretch where I can't remember what Lamar did. He made somebody miss in the pocket in just a disgusting way, but it came right on the heels of that Justin Herbert drive where he slides away from Marlon Humphrey coming off the edge to complete that pass. And then earlier in that drive is the one where he goes all the way back to his right to Josh Palmer on third down. And just that's the play on both sides of the ball, kind of top to bottom, was good in this game. But the two quarterbacks and the level that they played at, I can't even imagine what it was like to be in that stadium watching those two guys play at that level, considering some of the football that you've had to watch over the last 3 years.
yeah, I mean, I shouldn't be surprised by things that Justin Herbert does on the football field,
It
but I
feels
still
different right now, though.
it's every week, man. He does
Yeah.
something that just blows my mind. That throw to Joshua Palmer off his back foot all the way across the field from the left hash to the right sideline was just insane arm strength. And he just taps into that every week.
It
There's
makes it look
just a
simple.
it's like go okay, if you're listening to this and you remember that play, go out to a football field on Thanksgiving and try and do that. Like everyone should try and do that just to like put in context how ridiculous the throw is. And it's not like it's this looping throw across the field, like it's on a rope. The arm strength is outrageous. And I think he's been playing at an extremely, extremely high level, since the bye week. Like I was thinking about it this morning, like how many guys would I take over him right now? It's not that many. Like it's just not that many with the way that he's playing, the way that he's seeing the field. And then when you add in the element of him really energizing the offense week after week with his legs, and like even in this game, the scramble touchdown, like he's been doing it every week. It's been, you know, they had a better drive on the first drive this week, but in weeks past, it's been like, you know, offense is stumbling, they need a spark, and there's Justin Herbert on a 20-yard scramble. He's gotten healthier since the early season high ankle sprain, and adding that element to his game with his arm talent as well. I mean, there's just really no ceiling to what he can accomplish as a quarterback, I think.
It's interesting kind of considering the tiering in the top 5 to 6 guys, and I'm sure I'll forget somebody because I'm doing this off the cuff, so I already apologize for that, but the way that it feels to me right now, after the way that this season has played out and even going back to last year a little bit, Mahomes is always gonna exist in his own tier to me, just because I've done this before and I'm not willing to do it again. So I think you want to put him up there. And then on the second tier, I think coming into this year, I probably had Josh Allen a little bit ahead of Lamar just in terms of what they were offering their offenses. I thought Lamar had more weaknesses than Josh Allen did this year. And I've talked about this a bunch. It's the work he's done against the blitz and just how dangerous he feels no matter what you're throwing at him, that this version of Lamar is just different than the ones that we've seen in years past. That's the one specific I would keep coming back to. So I would put him and at Josh Allen probably on their own line. And then after that, I think based on the way that they've played this season, and I think this is always how it probably should have been and how we framed it, it's probably Herbert and Burrow
Yeah.
right there together on the next tier. And
Yeah.
if you're actually being honest about separating the quarterback play from the circumstances over the last like 3 years, that's probably the right outcome if you're trying to tier it out among those 5 guys near the top.
Yeah. I was thinking about this morning. I said three guys: Mahomes, Allen, Jackson that I would take over Justin Herbert right now. And then it becomes like a legitimate conversation, just because and you have to factor in who he's doing it with. Like,
Yes.
and that was a big part in this game that I think we should get into. They're down a score. 3rd and 6, Quentin Johnston is wide open on that crossing route. If he makes that catch, that's a 30-yard gain. They're probably in field goal range in that situation. They're threatening
It
to score
changes the
and tie the
entire
game.
game. It changes the
That was
entire game. The game flips on that moment because it's 23-16 when that happens. If they go down and score, we got a tie game. Instead, the Justice Hill thing happens almost immediately and the game
immediately.
is out of reach. And that's kind of what I was saying with the margins. You have the 3 4th and 1s that the Ravens get in this game, and then you have that Quentin Johnston drop. Those 4 plays end up changing the game. This is a very, very close game. It's going to look like the Ravens kind of outpaced them in the second half, but this thing swings on 3 or 4 plays that could have gone either way. And I think the Chargers being at that point where we can say that about a game against the Ravens says a lot about where this Chargers team is right now.
Yeah, absolutely. In two ways, right? It shows how much of an improved team they are, but it also shows that there are roster limitations here. And that's what
Yes.
I wrote last night. Like Jim Harbaugh and Joe Ortiz have done a fantastic job of turning this thing around in 1 year. They've hit on a bunch of free agents, draft picks, the mentality and the culture. That's all led to success, but there's missing pieces here. It's gonna take longer than a year to turn it over. And you move on from Keenan Allen and Mike Williams, and you bring in Ladd McConkey, who's a really good player. But like, who are the matchup advantages for the Chargers in the passing game? Like, who's the guy that you can trust to go out on a money down and win in man coverage? A guy that you feel like going to the game, this is a matchup advantage for us. There's one guy. It's Ladd. And then everyone else, Justin is elevating to, get things done in the passing game. And that's a really hard way to live. And it never really comes down to like one play, but that play was such a good example of like what they need on this team. Like they need a guy that can make that play in that situation, because all of a sudden Quentin Johnson makes that catch. They've got a blocker downfield. He's up the sideline. They're at the 15-yard line. All of a sudden they're in the red zone. They tie the game at 23. We're having a big change in the conversation that we're having today. And I will say this. I want to talk about Quentin for a second. He's improved significantly. It's honestly because everyone's watching this primetime game and they're going to think he's the same player. He's not the same player.
I appreciated Justin saying that last night afterward too, just coming to his defense. I thought that was really indicative of kind of what's going on in that building right now.
Yeah, and I got to give credit to receivers coach Sanjay Lal, who's gotten a lot more out of Quentin Johnston. His hands have been better. His route running has been better. His releases have been better. He's improved in all areas. He's a much more deceptive player. They've been using him better in situations that fit his skill set. This is a perfect example of how you should be using him. Stretch the field horizontally and get the ball in his hands. It was just a rough moment, but he has improved significantly. I think that's worth mentioning, that the coaching staff is getting more out of players across the roster, and Quentin Johnston's included in that, even though he had a rough moment last night.
I think that's a good example of kind of where the talent gap exists. For me, where it was most apparent yesterday is this team has done an admirable job playing against the run when you want to be who they are structurally. Playing a lot of light boxes, a lot of too high. It's like, all right, this is who Jesse Minter is, and you're putting a huge onus on your front seven players in defending the run if you want to play that way structurally. That was fine until you play against a team like this. And now that's where you start to see it, just the gap. And that's where you start to see the distance between them and a really, really, really good rushing offense like the Ravens have. And I think that's originally how I was going to start this conversation, but I want to talk about the game a little bit first. Is where have we arrived with the Chargers? And I think that's kind of where I've arrived, is that everything is being put in the correct place, but the individual pieces just don't stand up to the best teams in the NFL right now. And that's totally fine, right? That's what this team was. That's the best case scenario for what this team was going to be in 2024. You had to take your medicine financially. You had to shed some salary and some talent. You knew that was going to happen. And even if the defense is where they kept some of those guys, Bosa, Mack on pay cuts, etc., they still didn't have money to add players. They didn't go out and do anything in free agency essentially this year. We're talking about Tyre Tart, Christian Fulton, some fifth round picks. Like, that's how they've plugged some of these holes. So the fact that there's still a talent gap between this Chargers team and the really, really good teams in the league that are 3-4 years into contention and are at that point on the timeline in their build, that is a completely acceptable place for the 2024 Chargers season to end up. And I think that's kind of where we are.
Right. Like this is an indication of how far they have left to go, but that's not an indictment of what they're building. Like that's what I wrote. That's what I wrote last night. Cause you're exactly right. And like, I'll add Puna Ford in there as well, who I think is having like a Pro Bowl level season. They've been a huge
great play out of all of these guys. Christian Fulton had a rough night last night, but he had been fine for the most part this year when he had been healthy.
Yeah. He'd been their best corner, and he was in good position on that touchdown. He just couldn't get flipped around to find the football. The one thing I will say is a big part of their improvement in run defense is Denzel Perryman. Like at this stage of his career, like he does one thing really, really well, and that's get downhill and hit the crap out of people. And like, that's the guy that you really needed in this game. Like if there was one game that you needed to have Denzel Perryman on the field, it was this one. And not just from a playmaking standpoint. I was talking to some guys in the locker room because I sort of had a theory kicking around in my head. Like in early on that first Ravens touchdown drive, like you needed Denzel Perryman to meet Derrick Henry in the hole and hit him and show a bunch of these young guys in the defense, like, hey, this guy is human. Like he can take a shot. And I think that would have changed the entire energy of the defense. But once he got rolling, I think it creeped into the back of their minds that like, this is Derrick Henry.
It wears on your morale, man. I mean, it absolutely does, especially if you're a young team, you don't have a lot of earned equity together. I think that's actually a very good point. And the Perriman
Yeah.
thing I was gonna bring up, they were, they're a little bit banged up outside of that. Cam Hart didn't play in this game, who's had a really nice rookie season, but
And good
not
in run
having
support. Really, Cam is a physical player on the edge for them at
six
corner.
6'2", 205 corner, that certainly helps. And so, but the Denzel Perriman skill set, switching that out for like Nick Neiman and guys like that is
Troy Dye.
specific. Yeah, that is particularly noticeable in this game. So that I think is just the general state of where we are with the Chargers. The fact that they feel like this put together kind of composed team on both sides of the ball. They're putting themselves in good positions, but the talent gap is where this thing exists. Where do you think outside of receiver, which is kind of obvious, the other holes need to be filled in going into this offseason? We don't need to do this. This exercise isn't as useful for the Chargers as it is for teams that aren't going to make the playoffs. But because I have you here, I'm just curious where you think most of the work needs to be done.
Yeah, so I think you start with the interior of the offensive line. And, Bradley Bozeman was a fine signing. He is what he is. Like, he's exactly what he's put on tape his entire career. Above average run blocker, liability, and pass protection. But he's a fine stopgap. And from a mentality standpoint, he understands Greg Roman. He understands how they want to play. He's a leader in that room. Like, he's been exactly what they signed up for. But you need
It was the right move on a bunch of different levels. He understands the offense. Joe Ortiz knows him. Greg Roman knows him. I think that is the right thing when you're trying to scrape together a stopgap starter at that position.
Right, exactly. But you've talked about this so much, how much of a force multiplier a really good center can be for an offensive line. And like I saw it firsthand when the Chargers signed Corey Linsley, and like opened my mind to like what offensive football was actually supposed to look like when you had like a really, really capable center, especially in the running game, but also in pass protection. I mean, Corey was an incredible player. So I think you start there. I think you gotta find a long-term answer at center. And then, it hasn't just been Bozeman, it's also been the guards who I think have been pretty inconsistent. Like Zion Johnson, I think there was an idea of what he could be when they drafted him. And I don't think he's reached that level in terms of consistency. Like there are snaps that you can go to and say, like, watch him block Chris Jones one-on-one here. Like, and you see the potential, but I don't think he's found the consistency. And then they've kicked Trey Pipkins into guard. He had a rough night last night. He's dealing with an ankle issue. And I think that sort of popped up. He wasn't particularly good in the run game. He wasn't particularly good in pass protection.
This is a
And obviously,
consistent thing, though. The fact that he's banged up pretty much constantly is something that you need to fold into your evaluation of him and what sort of answer he is moving forward, because this has
right,
been a problem.
right. And he had the MCL a couple years ago. So credit to his toughness, but he is injury prone, to be frank about it. So I think you have to figure out what you're going to do on the interior, because you have two excellent tackles, two really, really good players. And right now the weakness is on the interior, and they're just getting beat for too many sacks, and they're not getting enough consistent push in the run game on the interior. So I think you have to figure that out. It's probably like an early round draft pick at center, and then, figure out what you're going to do at right guard. I wouldn't be surprised if they make a switch at right guard. Jamari Salyer played really well against the Titans. That was probably the most cohesive game they've had up front. And then they've been trying to rotate him in. Like they're basically subbing Jamari Salyer in for Trey Pipkins in short yardage and goal line packages. So they could, and honestly, like they are willing to do anything. Like they might just go on a full rotation at right guard at some point. So I think you got to start there. And then they need let me start here. Will Dissly has been way better than I thought he would be in the passing game, but they need like a
He's Will
legitimate.
Dissly.
Yeah, he's been really good. Like he's been way better than I thought he would be in the passing game. Like I thought he was just going to be like a control the C gap, like blocker tight end, but like he's done some things. Like he's made moves in the open field. Like he's broken tackles, but he sort of is what he is as a player.
He's
right?
a
So like
265-pound tight end. He is not a threat in the passing game in the way that you would probably like from like a seam stretching player.
Right. But even Will Dissly, like get him down the seam and Justin's going to potentially make like an all world throw like he did last week against the Bengals, where he's just ripping it 150 miles an hour down the seam in between four players and putting it right in between the 8 and 1 on Will Dissly. Right. But I think that's the other thing I would look at offensively is you need like a legitimate receiving tight end that can attack the middle of the field. And there's been some plays this season where Justin Herbert has made some, awe-inspiring throws that Will Dissly has not been able to come down with. So, I think it's receiver. I think it's interior offensive line. I think it's, a legitimate receiving tight end. And then you look at defensively, like there's some interesting pieces there. But like, we talked about, interior defensive line and, how they matched up with Derrick Henry, like they've gotten good play out of a bunch of players in there, like Puna Ford and Otito Abonia. And you mentioned Tierra Tart, Morgan Fox is having a good year. And I think they've outperformed, but I think you sort of have to look there. Edge rusher, right? Like what's going to happen with Khalil? What's going to happen with Joey? Obviously, they have a ascending player in Tuli Tuipulotu, but their fourth edge rusher is another veteran guy in Bud Dupree, who's on a 1-year deal. And so like those are the areas that I would sort of look at. The question is, what do they do at corner? Do they extend Christian Fulton? How much confidence do they have in two rookies, Cam Hart and Tarheeb Still? And so like, do they need like a real difference maker there? Do they need a real number one corner? What's the future for Asante Samuel Jr., who remains on IR with a shoulder? So there's a lot of areas to attack, but I would start with receiver, interior offensive line, receiving, tight end, and then, figure out what you're going to do along the defensive line.
I think that all makes sense. And the right guard thing, I was always a little bit skeptical of how the Pipkins thing would work out, just because his weaknesses last year were mostly like power and as a run blocker. And so sliding him inside, I was just like, I don't know how this makes sense, even if you think it's your best option based on what you got. The pass catching thing, I think, is right on. The Ladd McConkey stuff is so funny to me because there are shots of him every time on the broadcast where they show him in the helmet. There is not a bigger gap in what a football player looks like in his pads and how funny that guy looks and how productive he is as an NFL player. Like, it's incredible. His helmet is huge. That's why his head just looks so tiny in the helmet. But every time they just show him, I'm like, it's insane that guy is a non-kicker NFL player. And not just, we've seen guys that are smaller, like white receivers before. They're all slot merchants. The fact that that's not what he is and he's built like that and looks like that is hilarious to me. And that's not a criticism. We're the same size, me and Ladd McConkey, like 5'11-ish, 185. So the fact that he's doing this is remarkable to me. He's like a real player, and it's awesome to watch.
Yeah, he's a real athlete. Like he's a legitimate NFL athlete, like 4.39. And the route running to me is
Sudden, the route
incredible.
running, absolutely.
I mean, it was immediate, like OTAs. You just see him out there running routes against the air, and you're like, okay. And it was on tape at Georgia, obviously, but you start seeing it against NFL players, and like you knew immediately that this guy was going to be a good player. And I think he's a really good match for Justin and how Justin likes to play. Like you think about why he connected so well with Keenan Allen. It's like an understanding of leverages. It's being in the right place at the right time. It's the route running. It's all of these things. And so, and Justin has talked a ton about how Ladd is a very friendly receiver to the quarterback. He's always working back towards the ball.
Always.
And that means he's never really putting the ball in harm's way because he's really driving on the football all the time. So I think he's going to be a really, really good player. The question is like, is he a number one receiver on a Super Bowl contender? Right now, I don't think so. He is their number one receiver, but could he be that player moving forward? Potentially. I still don't know how effective he can be consistently on the outside. Like he really has been playing a majority in the slot, and that's where he's been most productive when he has a two-way go. That's where I would project moving forward. Now, if he's the number two, now you're cooking. Like if you have a legit outside guy, like now you're really cooking offensively.
I don't think we need to do it in terms of 1-2. I think it's just about deployment. I said he isn't a slot merchant. What I mean is that he's not somebody who's working the underneath areas of the field. He lines up mostly in the slot, but he is very capable as a vertical receiver. So if you think this guy is somebody that needs to be spending 65% of his time in the slot in the ideal scenario, you still need an intimidating outside presence, right? Like a viable outside presence. And I think that's what they're missing. I wouldn't even like theorize it as a hierarchy thing. To me, it's more, if we have this guy we like on the inside, we still need somebody on the outside. And I think that's where the gap is with this team.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
You mentioned Justin Herbert. And this is the last thing I wanted to ask you about, because this is like a theory I've been kicking around for the entire season. I truly believe that whatever Jim Harbaugh's weirdness is, and like the sauce that comes with that, and has unlocked a version of Justin Herbert that we have never seen before. Like there's a looseness to the way that he's playing. There's an aggressiveness to the way that he's playing. And you and I have joked about this. And I remember talking to Shane Day about it, their quarterbacks coach, during training camp. And I think he just thought I was crazy, but I was like, I wish Justin was 10% dumber. Like I wish he was 10% dumber. Like when I watch him play, I feel like the gap between what I want from him and what he was over the last couple of years, he would be number one in the progression if it's open, even if it's not enough option. I'm throwing it. He's making the right play all the time. And I think that offense and what Joe Lombardi was asking him to do exacerbated that, because you're asking him to play like Drew Brees, and it's kind of just like this robot processing way of playing quarterback. But he has one of the greatest physical skill sets we've ever seen at the position. So I do think that whatever Jim Harbaugh and that staff have done, where they've let him loose a little bit more and just the style that he's playing with, that is one of the reasons that we have seen a different version of Justin Herbert. What do you think of this theory?
I think you're right on. Yeah, I mean, like go back and rewatch the TV copy or the tape and watch his celebration after the rushing touchdown. I mean, he's like high and tight, running to the sideline. So here's what I think is happening. Jim Harbaugh is pushing Justin outside of his comfort zone from a personality standpoint.
Exactly.
He's making him stand up in front of the team
Yes.
and talk to the team, which is not Justin. Like after the Titans win, I believe, he was like, Justin, just talk to us, And Justin's like, that's not who he is. And I've asked Justin about this. I'm like, is it like it must be hard for you because Jim is obviously this like alpha quarterback, 15 years in the league and he wants you to be that, but that's not really your personality. He's like, yeah, but he's pushing me, outside my comfort zone. And that's really unlocking parts of his personality. You see it in how he talks to us. You see it in how he's celebrating on the field, the first down, all that stuff. And what it is now it's pushing him out of his comfort zone as a player as well. So you do I think that's probably Jim's approach. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but push him outside of his comfort zone personality wise. And then that becomes, pushing him outside of his comfort zone as a player. And that means a little bit more risk. Now he's thrown one pick all season. Like he's still really good at protecting the ball, but I think you are seeing a more aggressive person across the board in terms of how he's celebrating, how he's invigorating the team, and then also how he's pushing the ball downfield.
I don't even know if it's recklessness. It's looseness. Just like how willing he is to scramble, the way he's moving around the pocket. It just feels like he's not white knuckling things in the way that it seemed like he was at times over the last couple of years, where you could see all of the underlying qualities that would make this guy a special player. But there just seemed like there was a tightness to the way that he was operating, the way the offense was operating, that it wasn't allowing him to reach that level. And I do think that this offense and what they've been asking of him and pushing him outside of that comfort zone has kind of allowed us to reach this point. So it's been very cool to see. And I think that you can kind of feel that across the entire Chargers roster and just the way that the building and the organization feels since Jim Harbaugh got there. I'm sure you and I will have that conversation at a different point in time here over the next 6 months or so, because I do think it is a massive story in the league. Guys like that changing these buildings for the better. But for now, Daniel Popper, sincerely appreciate the time, sir. Always great to chat with you.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us now, it is our draft expert here at The Athletic. It's Dane Brugler. Dane, how you doing, man?
What's up, Robert? How are you?
Doing okay. Well, we're getting a little deep in the process for you now. I feel like things have crystallized a little bit since the last time we talked. It was about a month into the NFL season. So, you think how the big board is ultimately going to shake out. But now that we're cruising toward Thanksgiving, getting near the end of the college football season, feels like things have probably started to settle a little bit in your mind the way they weren't in early September.
Yes and no. Because this is the part of the calendar where we've got a lot of the tape and a lot of what the evidence that we're going based off of we have. And so a lot of these grades are being finalized right now, both for myself and around the league. You look at, NFL scouts, area scouts, they have to get in their final reports here in the next 2 weeks to their teams. And so this is the time of the calendar where it's kind of like that, just that last sprint. And for players, for college players, this is the time for, hey, this is a chance to make my last, audition and, final statement, closing argument for why my grade should be maybe a little bit better than what you initially saw in September or whatever. So I will say this is going to be maybe the most polarizing draft class that I've ever been a part of. I've been doing this the last 15 plus years. It's a very polarizing group that I think there's going to be just such a wide range of opinions on so many different guys, and it starts with the quarterbacks.
All right, so now you're whetting my appetite here. Let's start just on a broader level before we get into the quarterback specifically. What about this class overall do you think is going to drive that sort of polarization of opinions?
Just that, in my opinion, Travis Hunter is the number one player in this draft, the wide receiver corner. And, even that's a little bit unsettled because we're not sure exactly what his role will be in the NFL, and it will depend on who drafts him. And there's plenty of conversation with that. But I think he is the best player in this draft. After him, I think, someone's number 2 player in this draft could be another team's number 12 player. Like, I just think, like, the first, I don't know, 14, 15 players in this draft are gonna be all over the place. I think in past years
Give
or
me an
most years,
example.
well, I mean, okay, let's just say for last year, for example, when we knew Marvin Harrison Jr. was going to be a top 5 pick all through the
Mhm.
process. We knew Malik Neighbors was going to go somewhere in the top 7. Joe Alt, same type. We know that wasn't like a big question mark. This year, after Travis Hunter, then it's like, okay, well, who's the next best player? Who's the blue chipper? I love Mason Graham, the defensive tackle from Michigan, but he's not a Quinnen Williams type of prospect. So should he be a top 5 player? I think he's going to be 10, 11, 12 for other teams. You look at the wide receivers in this class. Tet McMillan from Arizona, Luther Burden from Missouri. Both these guys are good players, but they're not on the level of what we saw last year. So it's like, okay, the teams are going to look at them a little bit differently because of the strengths they have. The pass rushers in this class are fascinating because they all have warts for different reasons. And so different schemes are going to look at these guys differently. Take Georgia, for example. They've got 2 guys in their front 7. Mikael Williams, who 6'5", 265 pounds, his arms 35 and a half. I mean, it's a Travon Walker situation almost where,
I was gonna say the Jags are
yeah,
picking in the top 10, baby.
exactly. The traits are off the charts, and so it's like, okay, one team's going to look at Mikael Williams, who he's been banged up a little bit, but the production's not there. If you watch certain plays, you see, okay, yeah, top 10 pick, easy. But then you watch the body of work, and the impact is not there, and so that's going to be a fluid situation. Then the other Georgia player I was referencing was Jalen Walker, who's an off-ball linebacker for them. They don't let him rush more than 9, 10 times a game, but it's what he does best. And so I think some teams are going to look at Jalen Walker and say, hey, that's an edge rusher.
Micah
But we
Parsons.
haven't seen him do it consistently. So where do we feel comfortable drafting? There's just going to be a lot of differing opinions on this class, especially compared to what we've seen the last few years.
While we're doing the edge rushers, you have Abdul Carter as your 3rd overall player from Penn State on
Yep.
your most recent big board. What would his warts be?
He was an off-ball linebacker up until this year. It was kind of like the Micah Parsons thing, and he wears number 11 for Penn State. Is he? What is he? Is he? Because he's a freak athlete. Do you want to be moving him around the front 7? Can he put his hand on the ground and just be a straight rusher? He's a little bit undersized, 6'3", 250, and that's just not going to be a top 5 pick for everybody. So. And teams have to figure out too, okay, how coachable is he in terms of being a true edge rusher for us and what we want our edge rushers to do? So this is a class where, again, Abdul Carter for some teams I think will be a top 5 pick. Other teams, he might not be a top 10 pick. He'll be just outside of that because, yeah, he has the freaky skills, but there's some other things that they have question marks about.
Comparing this to last year, and you and I were talking a little bit before we started recording, and I think that contrast is really useful here. Last year we have Roma Dunze being picked at the back half of the top 10. You've Olafashana going 11th last year, and I know it's been an up and down rookie season for him when he has gotten put into the lineup, but this is somebody we were hyping up like his sophomore year at Penn State. Like that's the sort of prospect he was for a huge majority of his college career. He went outside the top 10. You got guys like Jared Verse going in the back half of the top 20, and now he's the most impactful rookie defender we've probably seen since Micah Parsons, from a front 7 perspective. And so it just seems like when you're comparing it to last year, especially, the gap between the quality of that class and the quality of this class is pretty stark.
I think the best example of that is when you look at the offensive line. Last
Mhm.
year, how many tackles did we have in the first round? And this year, like Amarius Mims, if you were in this draft class, say he went back to school to Georgia for a senior year and he was in this draft class, top 5 pick, easy. The way he's played this year for the Bengals, if you put that on Georgia's team this year, easy top 5 pick. But he was the 18th pick last year, and the top tackle this year, who for me it's Will Campbell, the left tackle from LSU, who some teams like him inside at guard or even center because they're right around 33-inch arms. They don't love necessarily how he fits at tackle for them. But if we look at last year's tackle class and put Will Campbell in last year's tackle class, does he go before or after Tyler Guyton, who was like the 27th pick to the Cowboys? So it's a really interesting, if you combine last year's first round and this year's first round, you go through if you go through like the top 20 players overall, it'll be top 25, top 30. It'll be dominated by 2024 prospects compared to 2025 guys.
Is that a little bit disappointing with Will Campbell? I know people kind of in the offensive line scouting community were excited about him coming into the year. Has he really not fulfilled some of the promise that people might have expected from him heading into this season?
Yeah, and that speaks to really LSU's offense as a whole and the offensive line as a whole. But he's a good player. I don't want to make it sound like he's all of a sudden a bum and can't play. He's my top offensive lineman in this class. He just missed my top 10 and over in my top 50.
It felt like it was more of
20
a
years.
no-brainer thing than that heading into this year, though, and the way that people were talking about him last year. I just remember in the discussions about Jaden Daniels
Yeah.
uh, and about Malik Neighbors, just like, oh, that the tackles for LSU, like those guys are studs. Like, just wait until they get drafted next year. And it feels like that conversation shifted a little bit, even if he is still your top offensive lineman on the board.
Yeah, I think it's easy to do because I think when you're focusing on Jane Daniels or the receivers, and out of the corner of your eye you see this awesome tackle who's doing good things. I
Yeah.
think we're all guilty of that. But then when you really focus in on how they're playing and performing, it's like, oh, okay, well, you wish this and this. And with Will Campbell, there's a lot of things I like. I mean, he reminds me a lot of kind of like a Jake Matthews, but he's actually a better finisher. Like there's a lot more grit to how he plays. But again, he's right around 33-inch arms. He's still young. He's 20 years old. He
Mhm.
showed up as a freshman and he started right away at left tackle. So 3-year starter, a young player, and you think he's going to get better. At the very least, even if you do have to kick him inside to guard, he's going to be an NFL starter for a long time. But in terms of last year's tackle class and how strong and deep it was, especially in the first round, it's just a big difference compared to this year, who Will Campbell's my first top tackle. And then, Kelvin Banks from Texas is a guard for me. Some view him as a tackle, but he hasn't played up to a top 10 level. He's more of a mid to late first round pick for that's how a lot of teams view him. And some teams view him inside at guard, some at tackle. His teammate at Texas, Cam Williams, he's not anywhere near it's kind of like the Amarius Mims situation where he's just not ready, but he's not as freaky as Mims was. So it's a tackle class that is really rough, especially when you compare it to last year's group.
I don't wanna excluding Ashton Genty from this conversation, because we're gonna talk about him a little bit later. If you're looking at your top 15 outside of Travis Hunter, who's the
Mhm.
guy you would plant your flag next to? Like, if you were and I know it's situation dependent, but a guy, if you
Yep.
were just starting a team from scratch, you're like, "This is probably the guy I would feel the best about outside of Travis Hunter."
I mean, I think it'd be disingenuous of me to not say like my number two player, which would be Will Johnson, the corner from Michigan. But I will say maybe like one of my favorite players is Malachi Starks, the safety from Georgia, just because he's so diverse with the different things he can do. I mean, he'll man to man against a slot receiver. He'll play single high. They'll play him in the post. He could probably play corner on the outside, no problem. Good size, great kid. He was a big time track athlete growing up. I mean, he's like a 10-5, 100-meter guy. So the speed and the testing is going to be off the charts. The ball skills are tremendous. So we saw Kyle Hamilton maybe get bumped down a little bit. We haven't had that
Brian
top
Branch
10
too?
safety. Yeah, well, and that was ridiculous. But yeah, we haven't had a top 10 safety in a while. It feels like Starks, it would be hard for him to fall out of the top 10, especially in this year's class.
Yeah, I think it's I'm sure we do this more than I do this. I'm guilty of this just because I'm looking at it through more of an NFL lens than somebody like
Mm,
you or a scout is. But I always just inevitably look at it based on, all right, what's happened recently that might reshape the way that I'm seeing these guys. And I feel like the Brian Branch slide and the Kyle Hamilton slide and the fact that those are two of the best 20 defensive players in the league now
yeah.
probably should inform the way that teams are thinking about those nebulous position players in the back seven. One of the other go ahead if you want to
I
respond.
was well, but even it's I don't know. It's still confusing why, because it's not like safeties are not easy to find. It's not like the running back conversation where you can find a lot of running backs that can give you a certain level at the position. It's hard to find those guys at safety.
Yeah.
So Kyle Hamilton, I understand a little bit just because he was so different. The Brian Branch one still boggles my mind. It's just hard to comprehend. But I do think your point is spot on with a guy like Starks, who just kind of checks every box. He might not be looked at as a true top 5 guy, but it's just going to be hard for him to fall too far in this class.
I think the difference is there's a difference between I'm trying to think of a good example here of a guy who's like a solid NFL safety, but he's more of a replaceable cog on the way that based on the way that he's used. Like
Grant
Alohi
Delpit with the
Gil
Browns.
yeah, like Alohi Gilman is
Oh,
like
yeah.
somebody you can find all over the place. But when you can walk a
Mm,
guy down and he can play man coverage in the slot, that is a different level of value. And so I think some of these guys, whether it's Hamilton, Brian Branch, the way that Devin Witherspoon is doing things for the Seahawks, like that's just a different tier of player. And so I think if you can drop down and do that, that changes the conversation beyond just being a safety to being more of a diverse defensive back that is warrants that sort of investment from a team. And it sound based on your conversation here, it sounds like Malachi Starks is that sort of guy.
That's the thing. You can see him do, and Georgia uses him all over the secondary. He's been doing it since he was a starter the moment he showed up in Athens as a freshman. So he's been doing it the last 3 years, and he's a guy that you could tell right away. His first game as a freshman, you could tell right away. All right, that's a dude. He's different, and he has not disappointed. I mean, he hasn't been perfect. Alabama tape this year, there were a few misses. But all in all, the body of work with a guy like Malachi Starks, that's somebody you want on your team.
Maybe the biggest gap between last year's class and this year's class, the offensive lineman notwithstanding, is what's going on at quarterback. Because we had 3 guys go top 3 last year, and then the guys that went after them, Bo Nix has looked great. We'll talk about Bo Nix. I mean, we've
Yeah.
had really good quarterback play when you consider all of the factors from that class last year. And you started your piece about your recent big board 2 weeks ago with a text that you got from a scout essentially saying good luck in trying to stack up this year's quarterback class when you told him that's what you were doing. So
Yeah.
let's just have an honest conversation about what we're talking about with the 2025 quarterback class here.
Yeah, and it's been difficult, to talk about this group in season because they've been so inconsistent week to week, and I mean, that says something about these quarterbacks as a whole. But when you focus on the body of work, I don't think any of these guys come close to the top 3 that we had last year. I mean, that's my opinion. That's also I mean, I've yet to talk to an NFL scout or exec who would disagree with that. It just feels like there's more risk involved with this group, more ways for it not to work out, as opposed with, even a guy like, Drake May, who we'll talk about more later too. Yeah, there are some areas of his game that are a little reckless and, it doesn't look picture perfect, but the strengths far outnumbered the weaknesses. And you're like, it's going to work because he's so dang talented. This year, it's not quite like that. So, all right, let's just history tells us a quarterback, at least one, if not two, multiple, are going to go top 10. And it's going to be really interested to see how that gets tested this year, especially with teams like the Giants, the Raiders. Plenty of teams are going to need quarterback in the top 10. In my opinion, the quarterback who is the favorite right now to be the first drafted is Miami's Cam Ward. He's already had the best season of any quarterback in school history based on the stats. The production has been there. He leads college football in first downs, plays a 20 plus yards. And then when you look at the traits, he's got a whip of an arm, quick setup, quick release, love his elusiveness in the pocket. And then NFL scouts, they speak really highly of him as a person, the leader, the confidence, the steady heartbeat. But when things are on schedule, he's really productive. When things get off schedule, that's when it gets interesting because he's a very loose player, which is what you love about him because it allows him to improvise and he'll create. And there'd be some amazing plays that he puts on film, but it also leads to a lot of YOLO plays where he's taking unnecessary sacks, low percentage risks. This past Saturday, perfect example, he had a pretty good performance against Wake Forest, but there were 2 to 3 plays that are just baffling, including there's an impromptu pitch where he's climbing, escaping the pocket. He finds the running back and just pitches it, and running back wasn't looking for it. The pitch was a little bit off. The result's an interception. And so it's a double-edged sword with Ward because and you have to live with it. His ability to create is something that leads to explosive plays. It'll also lead to negative plays. And I think some teams are going to look at that and see the more optimistic side, which is his ability to create, the improvising skills. And I think the other thing that teams are optimistic about is just the progress that he has shown, the
Mhm.
development. Because in high school, he was a wing T quarterback. And then what he was asked to do at Incarnate Word and then Washington State and now at Miami, he's gotten better each year, incrementally better. He hasn't plateaued. He hasn't taken a step back. The progress has been encouraging. So that's, in the column of why we should believe in Cam Ward. However, I think there will be other teams that are going to be not as optimistic, and they're going to see some of those concerns we just talked about and say, yeah, we like him, but we're just not going to roll the dice in the top half of round one. And I think another factor too is the ACC, the defenses in the ACC are bad, plain and simple. The best defense Miami has faced this year, probably Georgia Tech, which was the only loss for them on the schedule so far. So I would love to see Miami make the college football playoffs this year so we could see Ward against a Georgia, an Ohio State, a defense that's more in line with what we're going to see or what he'll see on Sundays.
That's an interesting style of player to talk about and how I wanted to frame this conversation. So I want to compare that to what you've seen from Shedeur Sanders before I take this a little bit wider. So if you were trying to compare that Ward as a prospect where the flashes are there, the high level play is there, but you're worried about some of the downsides. How does that compare to like the archetype of prospect that Shedeur Sanders is at this point?
All right. So I've learned the last few months that if you say anything negative about Shedeur Sanders, you officially hate him. There's no room for nuance.
Why is this, by the way? Why
don't
is there
know.
like this super vocal Shedeur Sanders community? Is it all like the Dion factor of this? Are there a ton of Colorado fans out there? Like, why is this happening?
Yeah, I think people think like if you say anything negative, you're just taking shots when it's more contextualized analysis more than anything. I don't know why it's an either you love them or hate them type of thing, but all right, we're gonna try and thread the needle here. Here's where I am at with Sanders, and this is what I've kind of consistently been saying all season. When you study the tape, you see a player who is tough, poised, and accurate. Three pretty important factors to start in the NFL. So I don't think this is a question about is Sanders a good quarterback or not. He is a good quarterback, and I think he can be a starter in the NFL. But we're putting him under the top 5 overall microscope because that's how we're talking about him. That's how I think when you look at this class in particular, you kind of have to look at him through that lens, and that's where it gets a little more complicated. So, like I said, tough, accurate, good place to start. I think he has very average physical traits, which I think can be problematic with the way he likes to play. The comparison that I've been saying, and look, this isn't perfect. It's not a perfect comp. It's not an apples to apples comp, but I'm trying to paint a picture. He reminds me of Jordan Love, but without the top tier physical traits. So the main reason for that comp is the style in which they play. They like to bounce around, backpedal at times, keep the weight on the back foot, try and access all these different throwing platforms to keep things alive. And it's just very similar to Jordan Love, except, okay, the key difference, Jordan Love has these physical traits that he can get away with it. Sanders is 6'1", maybe 207. He has a B-level arm. The ball does not jump off his hand the same way. And let me emphasize that, like, that's not saying he has a bad arm. There are plenty of, NFL quarterbacks that have B-level arms. It's just not an A-level arm like Jordan Love.
And they don't play like Jordan Love. That's one of the reasons Jordan Love can get away playing like that. He is one of like the most elastic, ridiculously springy arms in the NFL.
And Sanders is athletic, but he's not. There's a little bit more stiffness to his throwing, the way he throws. So with the way Sanders likes to play, the pocket movements are very sporadic. Sometimes it looks good. Sometimes, you're climbing, you're shuffling, it works. Other times he's running himself into sacks. He's holding the ball too long. There are times where he just backpedals 10 yards behind the line of scrimmage, and there's nothing the offensive tackles can do to help him at that point. So we're going to hear a lot throughout the process about Colorado's bad offensive line, which it's not a great offensive line, but a lot of these sacks that we're seeing on film, they belong to the quarterback. So to summarize Shedeur, I like him. I think he's going to be an NFL starting quarterback and very likely a first-round pick and top 15 pick. But there are aspects to his game, I think, that are going to give evaluators pause in terms of what we think his ceiling could be as a top 5 guy.
And the other part about that, the sack comparison, Jordan Love doesn't take sacks. That is one aspect of Jordan Love's game. Jordan Love does not get sacked. His pressure to sack rate has been one of the lowest in the league in each of the last couple seasons. I'm going to ask you a divisive question here that is potentially dangerous, but you'll see why I'm doing it in a second. If you were comparing Shedeur Sanders as a prospect to Bo Nix as a prospect, who would you have
Gosh.
ranked higher?
Yeah, and see, it's so tough to do this when,
I know this
um
is an unfair question, but you'll see why I'm doing it in a second.
no, well, it's tough to do because, like, I just got done watching the last 3 games of Bo Nix. So it's, like, so fresh in my mind that
Sure.
it's tough to separate that from where we were thinking about him at Oregon. Um, but I do think that, like, Nix probably is a better athlete. Um and Shador, I think, does a good job of avoiding sacks. He does it so much that he does avoid a lot of sacks. He also takes a lot of sacks. Nix, you could tell like he was just playing at a different level that final year. Because I think they're similar in the ways that they know where to go with the football. They know where the routes are going to come open. Sometimes they know they have to hold the ball a little bit long for that route to come open, and they can get away from pressure. It looks a little bit different. And Nix is doing it a much better job this year using that athleticism. But if you're going to stack them, I it would be really tough. I mean, I guess I would probably have Shedeur slightly ahead just based off of strictly what we thought of them as prospects. I would probably have Shedeur slightly ahead of Bo Nix, but
They're in the same
it's
zip code, though, in your mind.
yeah, in terms of not necessarily apples to apples players, but in terms of draft grades and, guys that you think, okay, yeah, these are NFL starters, but are we really sure they're going to be top 10 quarterbacks in the NFL? Like, because if you don't think he's going to be a top 10 quarterback in the NFL, you don't draft him top 10 overall. So yeah, I think that's fair to say because there's going to be a lot of differing opinions on, and it's we'll talk more about Bo Nix later, but where these guys end up. Obviously, when the moment Bo Nix went with Sean Payton, it was like, okay, yeah, there's a good chance this is going to work out. Shedeur Sanders, if he goes to, I don't know, the Raiders or a situation where it's just not set up to succeed, all of a sudden that could go south quickly, and it makes for a complicated evaluation.
Here's why I'm asking you the question. I think the Sean Payton part of this is really important. Bo Nix probably wasn't that guy either coming into the draft, where it's like, oh, he's probably not a
No,
top 10 play quarterback in the league. So how can you draft him in the top 10? That's when you're doing things in a vacuum.
right.
NFL teams don't operate in vacuums, right? If you're the Raiders and the Giants sitting there in the top 5, you need a quarterback. If you were the Broncos heading into this year's draft and heading into the 2024 season, because of the dead money from the Russell Wilson deal, you needed a cheap rookie contract quarterback. You needed to get on that timeline to make everything else make sense. And I think you could make a kind of similar argument for where the Giants and the Raiders are right now. So, is it worth taking the shot to find a starting level quarterback, even if you think the ceiling isn't necessarily that high? I would say for the Broncos right now, that has been worth it with Bo Nix. Maybe we get to a
Hmm.
point 2, 3 years from now where you see the gap between Bo Nix and the elite quarterbacks in the NFL and you think, and maybe this wasn't worth it. But right now, I think you can justify the choice. And I'm just wondering if for a certain team in the top 5 or in the top 10, if Shedeur Sanders is that sort of prospect and that sort of potential solution if you've painted yourself into a little bit of a corner.
And this is why we started this podcast by saying it's going to be the most polarizing draft that I think I've ever been a part of because the answer to that question, yeah, it's going to be different from every team, and they're going to look at their offense and say, yeah, if we add Shedeur Sanders to this, we might have something. We can have an offense that is going to move the ball up and down the field. He's going to give us a chance to win. Where other teams are going to look at it and say, I don't think it's going to be a fit. And something else that scouts bring up with Shedeur is it's when because this is a guy who like he's very very confident. He is very much like his dad, where when you're winning and everything's going great, it's okay. It's infectious, and everyone it's something that works really well. When you're losing, and like after the Nebraska loss earlier this year, one of their few losses Colorado has had, he made some remarks about his offensive line and said, "What do you want me to do?" Like this is he basically put his offensive line under the bus, and it's like, okay, when things aren't working out in the NFL, or there's say you have 3 straight losses or something, is that going to be a problem in the locker room? And so I don't know enough about Shedeur to answer that, but that is something that NFL scouts bring up when you talk about Shedeur Sanders. So it at least has to be part of the conversation as we kind of peel back the layers of what Shedeur is going to be at the next level, what's it going to look like. And yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think In a perfect world, we wouldn't really evaluate quarterbacks from the outside looking in until after they were drafted because it changes so much, right? The situation they go into, and what we think about it, and where Shedeur ends up could change how we think his outlook is going to be as a rookie.
Also, we wouldn't draft quarterbacks in the top 10 if we didn't think they were top 10 prospects, but we know that's not how it goes.
Yeah.
There's self-preservation things that go into this. You have to have an answer to ownership. It's like, this is our answer. This is what we're going to do over the next few years, even if you don't think that's the best possible solution. In this draft, there isn't going to be a good solution. So some team is going to do this because they think they need to do it. And I think Bo Nix was kind of a similar thing. Whatever Sean Payton is going to tell you, he was the best quarterback in the draft the whole time. But I
Yeah.
think that in a vacuum, Bo Nix is probably that sort of solution for the Broncos, where it's like, we need to do something. This is the guy that we think we can get to a workable place. Let's do this. And I wonder if some of these quarterbacks in the top 10 end up being similar sorts of landing spots for teams in that place as an organization.
Well, and what you said was so key about ownership, and fans need to realize that first round quarterbacks that's an ownership pick. They have very much a thumb on the scale with how that works, and I'm fascinated by the college football playoff this year. If let's say Cam Ward and Shador Sanders, they both have a chance to be a part of that. We'll see over the next 2 weeks, but I'm hoping they are because I want to see them on that type of stage, and it kind of changes things because if an owner sees a guy like Shador Sanders have a big game in a playoff game like that, it, all of a sudden that matters. Regardless of what the scouts have been putting in the work and doing all this, like that, the owner is really impressed by what a certain quarterback did on a big stage game. I mean, if Michael Penix doesn't have that 430 passing yard performance against Texas in the college football playoffs last year, does he still go top 10? We'll never know for sure.
I think
And
the
so
answer
I
to that
think
is no.
the college football playoff expanding to 12 teams opens up a lot of different avenues for quarterbacks to kind of change the narrative. Cam Ward could do it in Miami if he goes and just think back to CJ Stroud. We always liked CJ Stroud as a prospect. No one disliked him as a player. It was like, okay, but is he truly a top 3 guy, someone that you should consider at number 1 overall? Because things were not easy, but things were easier
They
against a
were
Big Ten
clean for
schedule.
the most part until that
Right.
Michigan game and that Northwestern game to an extent that year. Things were very clean for CJ Stroud in that offense.
But it was the Georgia game, that performance, that changed everything. That is what he did, even though it came in a loss, the way CJ Stroud performed, where he had to move his feet, he had to work around the rush. He showed a little bit more of his athleticism. It was like, okay, CJ Stroud, yeah, sign me up. This guy is the truth, and should be in the conversation for number 1 overall. That Georgia game changed everything, and so I think the college football playoff now being 12 teams and expanding the field, we have a lot more possibilities for quarterbacks to change the narrative.
You alluded to this a little bit when we were talking about Shedeur, but now that we have a sense of who's probably picking in the top 10, we'll have some shuffling around, but I think that the overall draft order directionally we
Right.
understand now. Are there any other mock draft pairings that you've just had a hard time getting out of your head right now?
Well, okay, we'll stick with Shedeur. I just the Las Vegas Raiders. It's just too obvious. We know that there's a Tom Brady and Shedeur relationship, obvious connection there. You think about Mark Davis and how much he likes to market the Raiders, and this is an owner who has an eye on, okay, how are we going to boost this brand and boost this football team? And Shador, I think he's just going to be catnip for Mark Davis. And then I, let's take it a step further. What would happen if, okay, there might be a head coach opening this offseason? Dion has coached Shador every single year. In high school, he was his offensive coordinator. Coached him 4 years in college, 2 at Jackson State, 2 at Colorado. Could we even see it go that far? So even if we don't see it go that far, I still think Shador with whatever head coach in Vegas, it's a hard connection to avoid when you're trying to do a projection this far out.
This isn't your beat. Again, I'm putting you in a bad spot even asking you. Do you think that that's a realistic possibility that we see Dion as an NFL head coach next year? This is
Man,
so far removed from my purview that like I have zero opinion on it, but you're a little bit closer to it.
Antonio Pierce was is a head coach with very little. I mean, he doesn't have that much more NFL experience. I mean, he was a college coach for a lot of years. He was a high school coach before that. So I mean, it's at least possible. It's at least something that some teams might think about. And I mean, Dion's won wherever he's gone. And you think about what he's done the last 2 years at Colorado. He won at Jackson State. He at least has an NFL background, where he's been in NFL locker rooms all throughout his career. He knows how things work. So I'm not going to say it's likely, but I'm not ruling it out as a possibility of a team, at least bring him in for an interview. And then, they might look at their options and say, hey, you know what? Let's see how this works out. And especially the Raiders, it seems like it's something that at least needs to be talked about.
Yeah, but again, if you're talking about branding and talking about marketing the franchise, I think that's a very quick way to do it. Very few head coaches would allow you to get that sort of heat and that sort of juice in the way that Deion Sanders would. Any other pairings in the top 10 that you
All
felt
right.
like you
So
coming back to at this point in the process?
two more. The Cowboys. Yeah, I think the obvious pairing with Dallas is going to be Ashton Genty. We'll talk more about him in a sec, but I think you look at it and like Rico Dowdle's been fine. The other thing that's part of the conversation is this running back class. It might be the deepest we've seen in a long, long time. Might be the deepest position in this draft. There's going to be, I would say, double-digit running backs drafted in the second to fourth round range this year, and so just another reason not to take a running back in the first round. And this team has so many needs on both sides of the ball. And I think you look at Mason Graham, defensive tackle from Michigan. Cowboys fans are rolling their eyes right now because Taco Charlton, Mozzie Smith. I get it, but let's not helmet scout here. Mason Graham is one of the best players in this draft, just pure stop. You don't like to put the word safe on any of these guys, but it's hard to look at Mason Graham and see him not making it as at least a very good NFL starter. He's a leverage-based player, strong hands, makes an impact versus the run, against the pass. Like I said, he's not a Quinnen Williams type of disruptor, that caliber of prospect, but he should come in from day one and make a positive impact. So Cowboys, Mason Graham, that one makes a lot of sense. And then Patriots and Ted McMillan, the wide receiver from Arizona. We know New England this offseason, they're going to make upgrades around their quarterback. Top wide receiver in free agency, probably going to be T. Higgins. Let's say that doesn't work out. Arizona's McMillan, he's basically T. Higgins in this draft class. He's not a burner, average separation, but the ball skills are exceptional. He's got this, I don't know, Gumby-ish body control where he's making these crazy catches. He high points everything, catches everything away from his body. It reminds me a lot of T. Higgins with the way he wins at the catch point. So the idea of pairing Maye and T-Mac together, I think that'd be a lot of fun.
To me, the best possible outcome for them still. How much cap space do you think the Patriots have in 2025 right now?
Over under 60 million. I'm gonna double that.
More than double that. It's
Oh my gosh.
$132 million.
Jeez.
So
So they got some
typically,
spending to do.
so and there's a chance based on where their roster is right now, and we'll see. Drake Maye. We do this all the time, where we look at these teams and we think that they're horrendous free agent destinations. Why would anyone want to go there? One thing dictates free agency more than anything else: money. Money dictates where players go in free agency. If you're willing to pay a tax, guys will go there. You know what comes second after money? If there's tiebreakers, quarterbacks. So even if New England seems like this horrendous outcome for anybody, I think that the combination of them being able to outspend anybody they want to for certain players and the fact that the quarterback has looked good makes it maybe more attractive than people might think at first glance. So the fact that they can
Yeah.
throw around anything they want for a guy like T. Higgins, being able to do that with a tackle in the first round, that still feels like the ideal outcome for me and New England. And mostly because the T. Higgins skill set, like you just said, with Drake Maye,
Oh
sign
yeah.
me up for that. I want that.
Absolutely.
I want a guy who's going to go get the ball for Drake Maye. So if they can double dip with a T and a tackle, that's great. But if they miss out on T, the fact that there's somebody that's bringing that to the table in your mind, I'm into that. I want to see what that would look like.
And it's because Josh Downs was kind of that guy for Drake Maye 2 years ago at North Carolina, and of course Josh Downs has not he's more of an undersized slot player. He's a really good player.
I love Josh Downs. Josh Downs is a
Yeah,
phenomenal football
awesome.
player, but he's not built like T. Higgins.
Exactly. So you give Drake May a guy like T. Higgins who has that type of catch radius and will go up and get the football, and he's a 4 or 5 athlete, but it's what he does at the catch point, and we know Drake May is not scared of throwing to smaller windows and maybe taking some chances, and so the pairing works perfectly. But exactly, if they come away with either T. Higgins or McMillan, I think the Patriots offense will be significantly better next year with just that one addition at receiver.
Why I think the T. Higgins path in free agency is the more appealing one is that players like T. Higgins don't usually hit free agency. Like, think
Mhm.
about the 1B receivers in the NFL over the last couple of years. Those guys are getting monster contracts. Jalen Waddle, Devontae Smith. The only reason that the Bengals can't do that for T. Higgins is because they are the Bengals. So I always want to know when a guy's hitting free agency, why is he hitting free agency? With T.
Right.
Higgins, very easy. Very
Yeah.
easy to tell that story. There aren't tackles of T. Higgins caliber that hit free agency. They don't. Those guys do
That's
not
fair.
hit the market. So I think that trying to find the tackle in the draft and be able to hopefully get T in free agency, that would be ideal for the Patriots. But obviously, that's a very narrow needle to thread.
Yeah,
We kind of
that's
touched
absolutely
on
fair.
we kind of touched on this a little bit when I was talking about Brian Branch and Kyle Hamilton, but I wanted to ask you if there's anything that's happened during this NFL season that has kind of recontextualized the way that you've looked at this draft class, whether it's positional value or certain archetypes of players succeeding. Is there anything that's happened on the field in the pros this year that has kind of made you rethink the way that you've looked at this draft class?
Well, and I don't know that's made me necessarily rethink as it's making me really intrigued on just the domino effect. Because one of the hot topics right now, obviously, you look at the running backs and just look at the top the rushing leaders in the NFL right now. Saquon Barkley, Derrick Henry, both over 1,300 yards, both on the open market this year.
Josh Jacobs
Josh
is probably third.
Jacobs, he was third, and
Yeah.
he was available as a free agent. And then even fourth on the list is Jameer Gibbs, and that pick was panned when the Lions drafted him 12th overall in that class. And obviously, the Lions have no regrets about making that pick. So the whole idea of maybe the market overcorrecting itself in terms of top tier running backs, how is that going to affect Ashton Genty, where he's drafted, how early? Because you could argue he is the best player in this draft after Travis Hunter. And when you look at the top 20 draft order, I don't think there's a lot of obvious landing spots. The Cowboys, again, they're going to get brought up a lot because we know they love Boise players. They have drafted running backs early in the past. Their offense could really use a weapon like that, but they have so many needs. Let's just take Dallas off the table. Say they're not drafting Genty in the first round. I mean, you look at it, yeah, the Raiders are a potential spot, but they need a quarterback and so much more. The Browns, they could be in the running back market with, we'll see what happens with Nick Chubb, but I don't think that front office is drafting a running back top 10 overall.
Nick
Um,
Chubb was an exception for how they wanted to view that position, I think. And even if you look
Absolutely.
at the Nick Chubb contract when it was signed, it was
hmm
still a step down when it comes to resource allocation for that position.
No question. You have a few teams that are kind of on the fringe where, like the Cardinals, for example, they have a lot of other needs as they kind of build that roster. But at what point is Genty just too good to pass up? And I know they drafted Trey Benson in the third round last year, but I don't think that alone is going to stop you from making the move. The one that's really interesting to me, the landing spot, where I think if you're gonna, because none of these teams you're gonna argue are, oh, they're a running back away from being a real contender. I don't think you're gonna say that necessarily with any of these teams. But an interesting landing spot, I think, would be Washington. Let's say they finish around pick, say 22. Genty
Interesting.
falls to pick 15. Is that the type of aggressive move a team on the rise like Washington would make? I feel it's very similar when the Lions drafted Gibbs, where, okay, running back's not the obvious top need, but to get a playmaker like that helps upgrade everything else. And I don't think it'd be crazy to see Washington or even, like a Denver, where if we feel like we have our quarterback, let's go make a splash. Let's go get someone that helps everybody else on our offense. So a team like Washington, a team like Denver, make a little move up to go get a Genty. To me, like that's kind of what makes the most sense. And especially with what we've seen this year from, if you believe Genty is a top tier running back, I don't think that's a big price to pay.
I've been thinking a lot about how I wanted to frame this discussion around the running backs in 2024 and how things have changed and how maybe we need to rethink some of the things that we've said over the last couple of years. I don't think you throw that stuff out the window, right? The
Mhm.
entire conversation about running back value was rooted in this idea that running backs cannot transcend their circumstances enough and cannot have enough standalone value to invest in a running back at that level. You need other things to be in the right place in order for the running back to succeed. So you have to put the other things in the right place first. That is still true. Like if you look at the teams that these running backs are on, they're all on really good teams with really good offensive lines. Saquon Barkley did not look like this while playing for the Giants last year. And the place that I've landed, and I do think this metaphor actually works on a few different levels. The way that I'm thinking about these guys, Derrick Henry, Saquon, Josh Jacobs to a certain extent, Jahmyr Gibbs is another very good example of this. They're accelerants, right? If you have a
Mm.
bottle of lighter fluid sitting on a desk, it doesn't help you very much, right? It's not doing anything. But if you've already started the fire, then things
Mhm.
can get really out of control in a big hurry. And look at where the Lions were when they drafted Jahmyr Gibbs. Everything else was
Yeah.
there. The fire had been started. The Ravens, the fire had been started. The Eagles, the fire had been started. Everything else was in place. The Eagles and the Ravens specifically, when they and I think the Packers to an extent, but I think that their situation was a little bit more nuanced than this because they liked Aaron Jones, but he had enough deficiencies in certain areas where they moved on and went a slightly different direction.
Mhm.
But for the Ravens and the Eagles last year, they just weren't getting enough from the running backs. Everything else was set up. And if you're trying to separate the running back performance from the offensive line, the structure of the offense, that we have stats for that. Those guys were not doing enough. Broken tackles, rush yards over expected, all those sorts of things. Now they're on the exact opposite end of the spectrum because of what these guys have brought. And the reason they were able to add them is because the market had dipped so low that even when applying resources to other positions, they could still afford these guys. So that's kind of where I've landed. This sort of running back, it should be last, not first. And if you can order it like that, then you're in a place to really throw some gasoline on the fire.
So with the 2 teams that I threw out there with Washington and Denver, could you make a case that, okay, maybe a guy like Genty is not the last piece, but are they far enough along with how they're building things that you can make an argument why that should be the move to go get a running back like that?
I think that Denver's a little bit further along because I like the offensive line more. Just in a vacuum, I think the offensive line is in a better position. Washington, they made smaller kind of marginal moves, but I think that we've started to see the gaps with a guy like Nick Allegretti, for example, right? If you were Washington, I think spending a little bit more on the interior offensive line heading into next year wouldn't necessarily be the worst idea.
Mhm.
The team that I would throw out, and I know this probably won't happen based on where they're drafting, but I think kind of falls in line with this conversation. What if you just dropped him on the Chiefs?
Oh gosh.
That's the exact type of situation I'm talking about here, where
Yeah.
the Chiefs have this incredibly efficient running game. Their offensive line is in a great spot. If you look at what they're doing down to down in the running game, it reminds me a little bit of what the Ravens and the Eagles were last year, but there's not enough explosion. The running back isn't lifting the rest of that unit.
Right.
That would no longer be the case if you had somebody like this. I don't think
It's
that
what they
he's going to be
wanted
there
to
when the Chiefs
do.
draft.
Yeah. It's
But
what they wanted to do with Clyde Edwards-Helaire when they drafted him.
that felt a
That's
little
what.
bit different to me though now. I feel like with that, it was like a pass catching thing where you're like, oh man,
Yeah.
if we this pass catching element, what will we do? I think that's the wrong way to conceive of a running back. I think it's about, all right, if we know that we can get 4.5 yards a carry every single time we run the ball because of the quality of our offensive line and the structure of our offense, what if we add a guy who can take that baseline and just crank it up all the way?
Mhm.
And that's exactly what's happened with Derrick Henry and Saquon Barkley this year. And I think the Chiefs are probably the best possible example for that sort of acceleration, even if it's probably going to be really difficult for them to land a guy like Genty.
That would be just unfair. Because again, you can make the argument that Genty is the number 2 player in the draft, in my opinion. I mean, he is that good. It's just a matter of where do you feel comfortable drafting him? It's almost like when like Quentin Nelson was coming out. Like he was clearly 1 or 2 on everybody's boards, but you're just not going to take him 1 or 2. And so, I mean, he still went 6th or whatever it was. But with Genty, it's a little tougher to figure out. And we went through this 2 years ago with Bijan Robinson, where it was like, okay, if Philly doesn't draft him, I don't know who else is going to draft. Okay, he still ends up going top 10, 8 overall. Like, there was a team that surfaced and it made sense for them. Whether or not it was the right pick. That it's irrelevant after the pick is made because that's what happened. How is that going to play out with Genti? Could we see a surprise team enter the mix, or is he still going to be around in that mid first range where a playoff team, could make a realistic move to go get him? That is going to be, I think, something we're talking about for the next 5 months.
I also think this is another kind of hallway off of this conversation. One of the reasons that it's probably not worth taking a running back in the top 10, it's not about positional value. If you're a team picking in the top 10, you certainly haven't started that fire. You certainly don't have enough of a foundation where the running back can be one of the last things you do to take things over the top rather than one of the first things. So I don't think I've ever considered it that way, but it's like that is more why Saquon Barkley is the second overall pick isn't worth it if you're the Giants, because you're
Mhm.
not at the point in your build where a player like Saquon Barkley is actually going to be additive to what you're doing. And that's kind of why I'm okay with the Giants walking away from Saquon Barkley. Like teams
Right.
aren't all in the same situation. Just because Saquon Barkley is doing this for the Eagles doesn't necessarily mean that moving on from Saquon Barkley wasn't the right thing for the Giants to do, even if it looks awful right now.
Right. No doubt. And I mean, it's also a bummer because I don't know if we're ever going to see a team do Hard Knocks offseason again because of how that played out, which is a bummer because I really enjoyed it. But
One and
yeah, no,
done.
yeah, yeah, I don't think any team's signing up for that after how it played out. But it was, I agree with you 100%. I think it's a good comparison to make. I just wonder how teams are going to view it now that we've seen some running backs really lift some offenses, because I think you're absolutely right in terms of the context of where those teams and those offenses are. But if there's a team that says, you know what, maybe they overvalue their offense more than those of us on the outside, and they think like, okay, we just add this little spark to our offense, it's going to make our whole offensive line better. It's going to I still think there's going to be enough GMs that think that way, and so it's going to make for some interesting debates as we kind of go through. Once we have the finalized draft order, we kind of go through where's the landing spots for Genti. It's going to be interesting.
Yeah, I think that it's important to learn lessons from what's happened with Saquon and Derrick Henry. It's more important to learn the right lessons. I think that is going to
Yes.
be the challenge for team builders as we come out on the other side of
Hmm.
this. All right, we do this every week on the midweek show. You've done this before. You're the only repeat ball knower on the Athletic Football Show this year. 3 questions that we ask all of our guests. The first one, what is something that you know on Tuesday, November 26th about college football or the NFL?
And I'll keep all my answers rookie related.
Perfect. Makes
Something
things
I
easy.
Yes, something I know. I know there are plenty of tweets being deleted right now as we speak from 8 months ago about Drake May being bad. Look, I miss on my fair share of quarterbacks, so I'm not going to pile on here. But it just felt like with May, people weren't focusing on the right things with him. Yeah, does he get bounce happy at times with his feet? Sure. It never stopped him from being a productive passer. Would his arm get juiced up at times and he would miss some layups? Yeah, but his college tape to me showed an accurate quarterback. To me, the biggest valid criticism was some of the reckless decisions and tendencies. He would press at times, and we've seen that in the NFL now with the Patriots. But it wasn't enough of a red flag where like last year I think he had 10 turnover worthy plays. For comparison's sake, this year Cam Ward's already at like 15. So when you stack it all up, the strengths just far outweigh the weaknesses. It just overshadows it. And going back, I understand why some teams and evaluators had Caleb or Jaden Daniels both ahead of May. I totally understand that. But the tweets, all the tweets I got in the spring saying he's never going to be an NFL starter or he's not a top 10 pick. Now that we've seen it play out on the field, it seems kind of ludicrous that people would think so low of May based off of what he put on film in college.
It hasn't been great last week against the Dolphins. There are negative
No.
plays, and sometimes he can make bad plays worse. For him to have the flashes that he's had, and for him to look as competent and capable as he does in that situation is a miracle. And I
It
think
is.
it's
Context
important.
matters.
And I think it's so hard to contextualize rookie quarterback play and to pull away what the situation is and what these guys are. We've been doing it all year because of what was happening with Caleb Williams, what was happening with Jaden Daniels. Look at Caleb Williams over the last 2 weeks compared to
Yeah.
what it looked like with Shane Waldron. The one thing I feel very confident about is if you drop a quarterback, a rookie quarterback, into a bad situation, objectively, bottom 3 pass protection in the NFL this year for New England, not
Yeah,
a good set of weapons. And that guy can still look like a functional NFL starter. I would not bet against that guy being a 10-year quarterback in the league. That to me feels like the cleanest thing to say about any of these guys is that I don't know if he'll be the best one. I don't know if he'll be
hmm
better than Jaden Daniels. I don't know if he'll be better than Caleb Williams. I don't know any of that stuff. I don't really care
yeah,
about that. I think that we've focused way too much on that this year. But I think
100%.
when you can look the way that Drake May has in those circumstances, you are going to be a capable, functional NFL starter for a while. And I feel very confident saying that.
Yeah, what happened with Bryce Young in Carolina where it was so bad to start and now it's getting a little bit better? That's more the norm of what
Exactly.
happens when rookie quarterbacks go in those situations. So, absolutely, what Drake has been able to do with that situation, if you're a Patriots fan, you should be nothing but optimistic about what it's going to look like in the near future as they build up things around him.
There's no doubt, and I think that this isn't like a toot our own horn thing. Like I don't care about being right about quarterback
Yeah.
prospects. I've said this a bunch of times. It's not my lane. It's not something I spend a lot of time on. I don't really have that strong of opinions on these guys. When I watched Drake May last year and the physical skill set he brings to the table, the ability to escape pressure, what he can do with his legs, sack mitigation, plus the arm talent, it's just not a guy I would bet against. I don't know what the
Mhm.
ceiling will look like, and the floor and some of the negative plays are probably always going to be there. But just as an overall package, this was a guy that was worth drafting in the top 5 at the end of the day, and I think that he has shown us that through 10 starts or whatever it's been, less than that, 8 starts.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a reason the Patriots were not giving up that pick at number 3. No matter the Giants or whoever
And
called.
the teams are willing to
Uh,
sell the farm to get it.
yeah,
There's a reason for
exactly,
that too.
exactly. And the Patriots were dead set on taking that pick. So yeah, I totally understand that.
Next one, what is something you think you know on November 26th?
I think if the Jets drafted Brock Bowers at 11, Joe Douglas is still the GM
This is
of the New
so
York
spicy.
Jets.
Why do you say this? You think that would be enough to have saved
Yeah,
him?
I do. Now, maybe he would still be fired at the end of the season, but it would not look this bad
Okay,
right
okay.
now. Okay. I'm not saying, yeah, he's GM of the year and, but look, the driving reason why they drafted Olufashinu is because he was perceived as the safer choice, right? It was, if anything was going to derail the Jets season, it was going to be issues on the offensive line, and Fashanu was going to give them protection there. Meanwhile, Bowers, he was the shiny toy, the undersized tight end who, and look, to be fair, in most cases, tight ends they take a little bit longer to traditionally turn out to have league success. But you look at a lot
He's
of
not a
the
tight
issues.
end.
Exactly, also true. But look, a lot of the issues that the Jets have with quarterback are probably still going to be there no matter what. Right? And Fashanu might end up being a really good player in the long run. I still believe that. But in hindsight, there's no question that the 2024 Jets offense would be better with Bowers compared to Fashanu. And I mean, who knows if the win-loss record would be any different? Probably not. But the offense would be better in a way that just with the way Bowers opens things up in the passing game, his receiving skills. And I get it in hindsight. It's easy to talk about draft picks. I mean, it's the ultimate form of Monday morning quarterbacking. But the situation was so unique because the Jets were in win now mode, and their choice came down to a pass catcher or a lineman because they had conversations about moving up for Roma Dunze. So in the moment, it felt like they went with the responsible choice, but in hindsight, threading the needle because they're already threading a needle. In hindsight, they probably should have continued to try to thread that needle with a big bet like Bowers. It was probably the right way to go, and I think the offense would look competent enough right now that Joe Douglas is still that GM.
I think where we misconstrued this and where we went wrong and kind of trying to evaluate where the Jets were, we assumed that Rodgers would lift the ceiling. So it was
Yeah.
more about protecting the floor, and that hasn't happened. So it's made the floor almost irrelevant. And I think that's kind of how we misjudged what the Jets needed in the moment based on where they were as an organization.
Yep. No, and that's fair. And it's like I said, they tried to thread that needle so finely that it made for one little misstep here, one little misstep there, and your quarterback not playing up to the level that you expected. And it's a house of cards, and we're seeing how that's playing out right now.
It's insane that all these guys are just on these Georgia teams over the last couple years. Like, you look at what Lad McConkey and Brock Bowers are doing right now, just an absurd amount of talent. And I'm looking at your
Meanwhile,
top 10, there's
Carson
like 6
Beck.
more Georgia guys.
Yeah. Well, meanwhile, Carson Beck, who was my quarterback one coming into the year, notice that we didn't even talk about him in this conversation. I mean, he's a 3rd-round pick now, and not having Brock Bowers or Lad McConkey to throw to turns out that's kind of bad. It's not good. So maybe
Almost
some
like
things
quarterback
were.
context is important.
Yeah, imagine that. Even at a place like Georgia, not having 2 guys that are doing really well as rookies in the NFL, it's turns out he misses those guys.
Also, Todd Monken was pretty good in those couple years that Todd Monken was there. So the
Also
fact that he
true.
might be a head coach here in a couple months, I think, speaks to the ecosystem that Georgia was dealing with for a good chunk of time there. Last one. What is something you still want to know as we sit here on November 26th?
I want to know that if the Falcons could have a redo, would they draft Jared Verse at number 8 overall? And this isn't even an anti Michael Penix topic. It just goes back to what we've said in the moment, what we've said throughout the last how many months. The luxury of drafting a player you don't plan on seeing on the field for a couple of years when there are clear needs on the roster. And this stat is ridiculous. Through 11 games this year, Jared Verse has 49 pressures, which is amazing for a rookie. Amazing for anybody, but amazing for a rookie. That is more than the Falcons' total number of pressures from the edge position combined. 7 players, 7 edge players on the Falcons do not add up to as many pressures that Jared Verse has. The Falcons rank dead last in the league with 10 sacks. That's less than 1 sack per game. We have not seen a team finish with fewer than 20 sacks in a season since 2021 by the Falcons with 18. So it's been a problem for so long, and instead of fixing it with they had 3 pass rushers staring them in the face with Latu and Dallas Turner and Jared Verse. They decided to go in a different direction, and I hope they're looking at what's going on in Los Angeles with Verse and saying, hey, we coulda, shoulda, woulda. But if they could go back, if you give them, I'm sure they're still pretty excited about what Michael Penix is going to be down the road. But if you give them truth serum, what would they say about how they would have treated that number 8 overall pick?
This is obviously colored by the fact that Michael Penix is not like a home run for sure prospect, right? He's a
Yes.
little bit
Yes.
older. He has warts. He has injury concerns. But I've softened on this a little bit. And there's going to be a conversation on the Money Down, or the business centric miniseries that we're doing on the feed a little bit later next month about about quarterback contracts in general, and about the finances that we're allocating to that position. And I think that there's part of me that believes we're kind of overstating the importance of the rookie quarterback contract window. Not that it's not
Mm.
important or helpful, but I think that this idea that it's just you need to everything you can to maximize it. And the gap between that contract and what you're paying guys at the top of the market, it changes everything about your team and all that stuff. I think we're kind of overstating that a little bit. And you guys can listen to that conversation with Brad Spielberger in a couple weeks. But I think part of that discussion and consideration is, for me, it's all about how good is your quarterback? Is your
Mm.
quarterback good? That ultimately, at the end of the day, is the most important question. And this thing that the Falcons tried to sell us about, we don't think we're picking that high again. We think this is a way to kind of get stability at that position, not only for the next 2 or 3 years, but for the next 7, 8, 10 years. What is happening? What happened with Jordan Love in Green Bay? Even if you couldn't maximize the contract window, you were in a better position as a franchise because you have that guy at quarterback. So even if there are some downsides and some compromises that you've made because you're wasting or burning 2 years of this guy, I still think that there's an argument to be made that having the transition and succession plan at quarterback is worth what they did.
It's harder to swallow when we're talking about a top 10 pick, right? I mean, Jordan Love
It
was in
is.
the
It is.
mid 20s, Aaron Rodgers was in the 20s. When you're talking about a top 10 pick in a very rich draft, it is tougher to swallow, especially when you have to sell it to a locker room that they know everyone in that locker room knows they probably could use an upgrade at edge. And you look at the Falcons right now; they're what, 6-5, barely holding on in that division. I would think most people think the Bucks are probably the favorite to come out of that division. So it's just now. I mean, if they drafted Jared Verse at 8 instead of Penix, maybe that wouldn't affect the win loss record at all. Who knows? But I just think it's such a it's such a risk doing what they did. And when we revisit this in 5 years, you know what? Michael Penix might be a Pro Bowler, and we were saying they did the right thing. That's exactly what they should have done. And maybe that's how we're talking. But right now, it's a bad look, and it's tougher to swallow when you think about how, GM, head coaches, how long they get to really see things out. And if the Falcons don't make the playoffs this year, that's going to be a tough one to explain to ownership.
I think that's totally fair. And I think that for me, it's again seeing things in a little bit more of a vacuum, independent of the short term needs and the short term pressures on these guys. But there's risk in not taking Jared Verse and what that does to your defense. To me, there is a bigger risk in potentially walking yourself into the quarterback wilderness in 2026 and 2027. And they hopefully accounted for that because I
Well,
think we've seen a lot of teams in that position where you just
no
don't
doubt.
have an answer. And now you're like, what are we going to do?
No doubt. And that's why this was my answer to this question, is because I don't think this is like a slam dunk. They would have taken Jared Verse at 8 if they could redo things. I'm genuinely interested. What was their conviction on Michael Penix? Now that they've seen how things have played out this year, if they could go back and change it, I'm genuinely interested to see if they would do that. Just because I'm interested what their conviction is on Penix, and if they think they maybe, if they have any regrets, what is their regret level on doing what they did, or if they're still totally dug in, we did the right thing. We know what they're going to say publicly. Like, obviously, they're not going to come out and say anything like that. But in a personal conversation between GM and head coach, would they, maybe change a few things with the way that things played out?
So here's my read on the situation. The GM is in year 4, right?
It's Kyle Pitts' first draft, I think.
So you so 21, 22, 23, 24. So this is 4 years, right?
Yeah.
The head coach is in year 1.
Hmm.
And I think a lot of the appeal of Michael Penix is rooted in the type of quarterback that the Rams had over the last couple of years. And that sort of arm talent. And what a guy like that who can play that way from the pocket, access all levels of the field does to your offense. So if this was a pick that was, if not driven by, then encouraged by the coaching staff who is
Yeah.
in year 1, there's a little bit longer of a runway there than there is for a front office that might be feeling a little bit of pressure. So I think
Yeah.
this feels to me like something that was driven with the conviction of guys who watched Matthew Stafford up close for the last couple years, rather than a guy in year 4 that hasn't done a lot of winning in Atlanta.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And like I said, 3 years from now, we might look back and say, "Oh, okay, you know what? They nailed it. Even though they had to take their medicine early on, they end up looking like they made the right decision." And something that as time goes on, we will find those answers. I'm just really interested to see what the temperature is for them personally, if they feel like they made the right move or if they have any regrets at all.
All right, last one here. We do our upon further review segment on these midweek shows. Just something that you went back and watched here over the last week or so that you wanted to chat about. What is that for you coming out of week 12?
Yeah, and this is where we talk about Bo Nix, and how impressive he's been, especially compared to how it started and compared to our expectations. And the moment he was drafted, it felt early, but he was paired with Sean Payton, so it's like, okay, yeah, this has a really good chance of working out. And it's funny, I'm going back, I'm watching him, and then I'm reading my report, and there's nothing wrong, I would say, about how I identified his traits, but I don't think that myself or a lot of us, we valued some of his strengths. And the last line of my report was, he understands where to go with the football, and his scrambling gives defenses fits. And that's kind of exactly what we've seen from him. I don't think we gave him enough credit for how that would work at the NFL level. So Nix, he's been pressured 135 times, only taken 19 sacks. I think the pass protection has been a little bit better as we've gone on throughout the year.
I think it's
But
been
a big
excellent.
part,
You watch that
yeah,
team, and they're playing defensive lines over the last few weeks, but I've been
yes,
really impressed with what they've been able to do up front.
especially some of those games early on. I think they've really shown progression as we've getting deeper into the season. But now that but part of this is the quarterback buying time and creating, and something that just watching him against Vegas on Sunday, and routinely escaping, turning a negative into a positive. He ranks 4th best in the NFL in terms of pressure to sack ratio, behind only Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, and Jordan Love. So I don't think that we gave him enough credit pre-draft for that ability. We knew he could do it, but we didn't maybe give him enough flowers for, okay, this is what's going to help make him a successful NFL quarterback.
Yeah, I've been very impressed over the last few weeks, and I do think that the pass protection has really set him up well, especially in this run where he's like dominated the Panthers, dominated the Falcons, probably the two worst pass rushers in the league. But even against teams that have a little bit more juice, his ability to escape, to create, to extend plays, and just the willingness to push the ball down the field a little bit more over the last month or so compared to what it looked like early on. I mean, he's ripping throws over the middle of the field, deep digs, and big crossers, and that conviction and that aggression, I just think paired with the stuff you're talking about where he's raising the floor because of his ability to mitigate pressure, to make plays outside of the pocket, he is a very capable rookie quarterback in the NFL. And I think when they surround him with hopefully some better weaponry over the next year or so, and you combine it with Sean Payton and the offensive line he's playing with, it's an offense that I'm much more intrigued by than I expected to be coming into the year. That's for sure.
Yeah, and he was always a confident player. That's something you really liked about Bo Nix, especially growing up an Auburn fan. He was Auburn royalty. Things didn't work out there, so he has to leave with his tail between his legs. Then he goes to Oregon, and he's a Heisman contender. He was able to rebuild himself, and to have the competitive toughness and the confidence to do that says a lot about him and his character and the way that he is able to compete. So yeah, it's no surprise that I think he has stood up in the face of NFL pressure and has been able to rise above it. And that's been cool to see.
Dane Brugler, always a pleasure, sir. We'll have you back sooner rather than later. We're going to get to the end of the college football season. We're going to be rolling into draft season, and we'll be on to talk all things draft as we get toward the end of the year into the new year. So appreciate the time. Enjoy the holiday week, and we will talk to you very soon.
Thanks, man. Happy Thanksgiving.
All right, guys, that's all we got. Thank you so much to Daniel. Thank you to Dane for their time. We will be back on Friday. Slightly truncated version of the weekly preview show just because we have to record it a day early because of Thanksgiving. But we're going to be breaking down 5 games on the Week 13 slate. That is going to be in your feeds on Friday like it would be any other week. We're taking a week off from the Money Down. That is not going to be available on Saturday. We're going to wait until after a holiday weekend to release the next episode of that. So that will be coming your way on December 7th. So if you were looking for those and it's not there on Saturday, that's why. For now, that's all we got. Appreciate you listening. We'll talk to you soon.